Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm Margot Heller, the director here at South London Gallery, and really delighted to welcome you this evening to this, what I hope is going to be a very special event, an inspiring meeting of minds, thoughts and ideas. This conversation is going to be between Alvaro Barrington, the artist, and leading economist Mariana Mazzucato. And it feels really lovely to be here, sitting in the midst of Alvaro's current show at the South London Gallery, Spider the Pig, Pig the Spider, which finishes this Sunday and has been really fantastically successful. It's a show that raises so many issues, from the meshing of different cultural influences and experiences, the relationship between the global north and the global south, climate change and the impact of the digital world on visual culture and the way we live our lives. Alvaro and Mariana met for the first time on Sunday night. And I discovered just by accident that Alvaro's a great fan of her work. So I'm really delighted to have been able to introduce them to each other, and really thrilled, but also actually honoured that you're here to have this conversation this evening. This is where I take a deep breath for Mariana's introduction, because Mariana is Professor in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London, where she's the founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Her work challenges orthodox thinking about the role of the state and the private sector in driving innovation, how economic value is created, measured and shared, and how market-shaping policy can be designed in a mission-oriented way to solve the grand challenges facing humanity. She's the winner of international prizes, including the 2020 John van der Nauman Award and the 2018 Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economics. She serves on South Africa's Presidential Economic Council. She chairs the new World Health Organization Council and advises governments and policy makers worldwide on state investment and innovation, sustainable and inclusive growth, the green transition, and industrial strategy. Amongst her many achievements, she's published 3 important and hugely successful books. Do go and buy them if you haven't already. The Entrepreneurial State, The Value of Everything, and Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Everything. So, that's quite an introduction, and that's not even scratching the surface. Alvaro's introduction is in his work. Is that fair to say? Is that enough?
I hope so.
Yeah. Me too. So Mariana and Alvaro are going to talk for just under an hour, and then at the end you'll have an opportunity to ask any questions. So thank you so much again for coming, and enjoy. Over to you.
So, firstly, thank you, Mariana, for saying yes. It was kind of a really odd request and I just, I have this, so I'll tell this weird story. Whenever I work with people in my studio, we have 2 days where we watch a bunch of different things that kind of maybe help folks understand the ethos of my practice. And we watched like Dave Chappelle's Block Party, and if you haven't watched it, you should watch it. And we'd watch hours of Mariana talking. And so when Margot asked me who would I like to talk to, it was sort of a long shot, but I said, I really love the thinking of Mariana, and she was like, oh. and so now that's how we're here. And I hope maybe at the end of the conversation, it'll make sense. But I imagine that a lot of you are here because you're artists, and that y'all are makers. And Mariana is an economist, and she's probably one of the most brilliant thinkers operating in the world today. And I think oftentimes what's really great about me listening to Mariana is that she gives a larger context of economic context of where we are, how we got here, what are some of the underlying structures that lead to certain things. And a lot of my practice, including in this show, is sort of asking myself, like, how do we get here, and where are we going? So anyway, I don't want to talk too much, but I thought maybe I should maybe jump into a question, because a lot of this, and maybe some of you haven't seen the exhibition, but part of the work is sort of looking at where we'll be in a few years from now, when we are kind of living in between like AR and AI, where like everybody will have like a augmented reality glasses on, and they'll be able to see themselves in this sort of what Zuckerberg called like the metaverse. And anyway, so I'm kind of all over the place because I'm a little nervous, but so maybe I'll just jump into a question I was sort of I was gonna hope to lead into, but so which question? All right.
And he has 2 glasses of wine. I have one.
I'm a bit of an alcoholic. So a lot of the things that you're interested in sort of the research and the advising and stuff that you do is talking about co-created values. And I was hoping maybe, actually, let me just ask a question. Okay, sorry.
But that's what we talked about at dinner the other night.
Yes.
Values co-created.
We had a long conversation about.
Basically, we've already done this.
I know,
So we're like,
and you guys
should we do it again?
And you guys should have been at the dinner.
They just came too late.
You guys should have been at the dinner, but now it's over. The dinner's over, and now we're just gonna sit here and maybe hopefully get some drinks later. Okay, so because it's sort of I'm hoping that you guys saw the exhibition, and also hopefully that you guys have sort of like listened to Mariana in the past. But all right, so I'll just jump into it. You've advised many leaders from around the world, and you have like a practice-based theorizing approach to how you work with government. So not only like just having the sense of academia, but also like how do you practice these sort of theories. And so you go in and you'll work with a government for years, several years, whether it's starting a bank or whatever. And so I was I'm wondering, what do you see as some of the most interesting conversations around public value that are being created right now?
So it's a great question. And I guess, first, what I find really problematic is that the people who talk about value are often really kind of like arrogant, I want to say pricks, but like people who have this like confidence of saying, I'm a wealth creator, I'm a value creator. So I think Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, the whole kind of Silicon Valley world. And that world would never have come into existence without huge amounts of collective, using kind of your words, and I love hearing you talk about this, collective value creation, of which part of that collectiveness was, in fact, the public sector. Everything that makes your phone smart and not stupid, here's my stupid phone, no, it's a smartphone, was publicly financed. So internet came out of DARPA, GPS, the Navy, touchscreen display, the CIA, but you didn't know that. Next time you touch your phone, be careful. The voice-activated system and so on. So then you needed these private sector companies to do amazing things with that. And of course, Apple has historically, really interesting people that come from the music world, the math, the computer science, and that itself is an interesting lesson how we should be valuing humanities and not just STEM subjects, but the narrative, the storytelling about value and wealth creation is all about these kind of garage tinkerers, the private sector, the entrepreneurs. Whereas that public bit is under-theorized, it's under-told. And that's why I began my book on value of everything, with Plato's wonderful quote that storytellers rule the world. So how we tell stories about where value creation comes from is really important. You don't hear school teachers and nurses talking about themselves as value creators. They just talk about the work they got that day, maybe the inspiration they have from the students, but these concepts and words and narratives and stories about wealth creation are really artificial and don't capture what you and I talked about the other day with dinner, which is this amazing collective effort. And so the question I have, maybe for you, coming back, is in a moment of capitalism where it takes a crisis like COVID-19 to unlock money, a shitload of money, like in the US now, this $1 trillion infrastructure bill, just years after them saying there was no money. What does it mean to actually embrace collective value creation to make sure that we don't lose the opportunity? So we're just kind of plowing money into the economy as we did after the financial crisis. If we don't have a discussion of what are we financing, how are we financing it, the kind of experimentation that's required in terms of the diversity of different views of the future we have ahead, it's kind of a wasted opportunity. And FDR, of course, was famous for saying experiment, experiment, experiment on the back of the Great Depression.
One of the things, firstly, I think one of the things I was always really excited to listen to you speak is that you talk about like this sort of narrative that we've inherited, because it is a sort of narrative that we kind of internalize. Like somebody once told me a very long time ago that if you're able to, the value in cultural production is that culture is a story we tell ourselves about ourselves. And so if you're able to create a kind of logic for someone to then define themselves, then you can then kind of immediately control how they emotionally may act around something. So like if you identify as liberal and then you hear, this gay person got beat up, your emotional reaction is like, it must be homophobic, it must be this, it must be that. If you tell yourself you're conservative, if you identify as conservative, you go, that gay person was beat up, then you have this other narrative of, they must have deserved it, blah, blah, blah. And so, especially in this sort of Twitter economy where you could kind of have like a kind of 140 character output, and then you sort of then define somebody's emotional feelings about something, how angry they get, how sad they get, because you sort of created this narrative that then forces sort of predictive behavior patterns. And so I always thought about painting and art as a sort of depiction of as a sort of tool in terms of what are the narratives that we're putting out there. And a quick example just from how I grew up in Brooklyn is that, there's a painting of DMX over there, and DMX talked about, at the time where the government was talking about young black men coming out of prison as super predators, he was talking about what does it mean to be a 14-year-old kid locked up in a hole affecting his mental health. And so today we have this conversation around prison reform and mental health because DMX put that narrative out there, or was part of the contribution in putting the narrative out there. But also one of the things, to Mariana's point, is that we've also internalized this sort of narrative of who are the innovators without sort of understanding the risk that we collectively, with our tax-paying dollars, are putting towards these things that end up creating huge profits for large corporations, whether it's Apple or whatever, when almost all of the technology, all of the innovations in a lot of the innovation in most of these things are either originally funded by our taxpayer dollars or kind of continued by our taxpayer dollars. And I was actually going to turn a question on to Mariana, where it's where you've spoken about UBI, or universal basic income, falling short of asking the fundamental questions around value creation. And I'm hoping that you could expand on that, and what are the questions we should be asking before Zuckerberg defines the metaverse. And, or is it that is it conversations about the subsidized risk with these profits, or is it something else that we need to think about?
I like how you arrived to the question. It's very non-linear, as economists are often too linear, and so you get to the question, which has been too kind of structured. So I like the question and how you got to it. So the reason why, I mean, maybe I'll start with the end. You know, when you tell a joke, you tell the punchline, like, then it's no longer funny, but with this, it's going to have to work. So the reason I don't like UBI, or it's not true. The reason I think the UBI, Universal Basic Income approach, is problematic is it doesn't actually question where does the wealth come from in the first place that then we redistribute through Universal Basic Income. So I'm more in favor of concepts like the citizens' dividend. And I have to be careful when I use the word citizens after Brexit. So it's more like citizens in the Aristotelian sense of citizenship, which today would be like human rights. People who live in a place. Is that an ice cream truck?
There's some ice cream.
Oh my God, that's like very early. Usually that's in the spring. Are we in Peckham? Is there actually an ice cream truck outside? Anyway, so the citizens' share, or the citizens' dividend, the reason I like it is it comes from this idea that if we collectively create wealth through the kind of ideas that we've just talked about, then we should also share that wealth in that collective way. Whereas universal basic income doesn't upset the narrative that wealth is created by this small group of kind of white guys in garages in California and Silicon Valley, and they will generously distribute some of that wealth through checks that are given out by the state. So even though the end result might be the same, literally the check you get in the mail might be, I don't know, let's just say 20K, the narrative and the story of why you're getting that check does matter. It matters literally in terms of the confidence in the room with the negotiation. And you know, the concept of the Green Deal, which I'm sure you've all heard of, or the New Deal after the Great Depression in the 30s, I kind of feel like the word deal, the deal, has been under-theorized. So as Greta says, green, just listen to the scientists, but the deal requires a new social contract. And that requires these kinds of conversations and others. And the reason why, you know, this kind of backtracking a bit, so modern day capitalism is kind of screwed up. I'm sure you all know that's why you're here. If everything was fine, you'd be watching TV or something at home. You're here because you kind of want to hear different voices. Modern day capitalism is problematic for all sorts of reasons. One is because the financial sector, which is huge, it's massive, basically has been financing itself. 80% of global finance goes back to finance. So finance is financing finance. So 80% goes to finance, insurance, and real estate. The acronym is FIRE. Handy. Business is also financialized. So $4 trillion have been spent by the global corporates, the large 500, Fortune 500 companies, just on buying back their own shares. So they buy back their shares to boost stock prices, to boost stock options, to boost executive pay, right? So instead of reinvesting those profits back into the real economy, they invest it in buying back their own stock just to maximize shareholder value. So on the back of that, there's been this whole like debate amongst those same corporates saying, oh, maybe we're fucking up, like that's not gonna help us solve climate change. We need a different concept of stakeholder value. So they're moving away from this concept of maximizing shares. Sorry, this is kind of needed. I promise I'll bring you back in.
No, I love it.
So maximizing shareholder value to maximizing stakeholder value and using concepts like purpose, the purposeful company, right, to kind of galvanize that. But the problem is, if that's just seen as something that they have to do, kind of giving again in this arrogant prick kind of way themselves all this attention, like we are the rulers of the world. We will change things. We will move from maximizing shares to maximizing stakeholder value. It doesn't upset the concept that they rule the world, right? So coming back to where wealth and value have actually come from, huge amounts of collective effort, just by putting all this emphasis on what they have to do doesn't change. So I think one of the interesting things is how can we move that concept of stakeholder value, which basically means bringing lots of different actors to the table, away from it being just about where wealth gets redistributed through UBI or other forms, to actually how do we create that value differently in the first place, right? So kind of in a pre-distribution, not redistribution kind of way. These are all sexy words that you have to write in your notebook. So just kidding. He does really cool notebooks. I got one here. I'll show, I don't want to get them jealous. Anyway, so I think that's where the action's at, and that's why I think artists and people like yourself who are thinking, making us think in different ways, those voices are so important in a moment like this, where again, after the financial crisis, we have this health pandemic, we have the climate crisis, money pours into the system, and unless we use that opportunity to change how we value, what we value, how we construct, and like the different voices that should be at the table, if we don't do that, we're just reproducing the conditions for the next crisis.
That just brought me to like a very ignorant understanding that I have of the last few hundred years in terms of that deal, that social contract that we end up having with our government. And so how I sort of think of history and where we are today, because I graduated from art school with $260,000 in debt. I was looking at like $5,000 in interest payments alone without paying the principal. And I was going back, my home is in New York City, and I was going back to like a very, very, very expensive city to live in. And I kept thinking about how did we get here? And so I thought there were one of the ideas of the New Deal was sort of, there was a social contract that was now created where many things was happening, but housing became a right. Mm-hmm. And so your house was sort of where you raised your family. And in fact, a car, which was not a right, was sort of more expensive than your house that you were buying. Mm-hmm. And education was also a right, because it was sort of understood that educated group of people would better society in general. And then by Thatcher and Reagan and sort of the neoliberal concept, and it was kind of really expedited under Clinton and Bush and Obama, but it was sort of this idea that education was a privilege and housing was an asset. Yeah. And so once housing became an asset, it became this thing that like now was sort of in the free market that was all sort of based on how much how much demand it is in the market. So if there's my parents who bought their house for relatively inexpensive because that neighborhood is now quote unquote gentrified, it's now millions of dollars, and most people couldn't even move back there. So I was wondering, what you're sort of asking is that we enter into a new deal. And I was wondering, because I know you do have a book, and I would hope some of you at least buy the audiobook, if there's some insight into these new deals that you're thinking about that we need to consider.
So thanks. You keep talking about my work, but this room is full of your work, which is so cool. At some point, we'll talk about your amazing work, which I find incredibly inspiring. And so thank you. Thank you so much for choosing me as your, interlocutore here. So first of all, you mentioned debt and student debt. Mm-hmm. I don't think people appreciate just how large the student debt is globally. In the US, the amount of student debt makes Lehman Brothers, when it collapsed, look like Toy Story, literally. Like Lehman Brothers was nothing compared to the student debt, mm-hmm. which will go unpaid. Because if real wages don't increase, and we just like pile on debt into the system, the system collapses. And even though everyone talks about public debt, deficits and debt to GDP and all this pressure on governments to do austerity, so arts classes in schools are cut, music classes are cut because apparently there's no money. The financial crisis was actually caused by private, not public debt, first of all. I'm sure you all know that. And second, you might not know this, private debt is back to the level it was before the financial crisis. So we're about to have another I hate to tell you this because we have COVID, which we still have to deal with, but the truth is, besides climate change and the health pandemic, we're about to enter very soon another financial crisis. It's about to burst. Remember, you heard it here. So the ratio of private debt to disposable income is back at the level it was just before the financial crisis hit. And so what's crazy is that then you have COVID, and you think we're like waking up and like, oh shit, we got another crisis to deal with. Let's make sure that what we do solves the problem and doesn't just create another problem. If you look at what's happened under COVID, both globally, in terms of what's happened also to many developing countries, but also just here in the UK, we increased loans, more debt. We gave more loans to companies that were experiencing problems, or loans to people who couldn't pay their mortgages. And globally, a lot of debt is going to developing countries in order to kind of buy the vaccines or whatever they need. So we're just piling on more and more and more debt. So your point about student debt should not go unnoticed. It is literally the cause of many of the ills of modern day capitalism, which is this financialized form of capitalism where we think we can just like make it easier for people to buy stuff if their wages aren't increasing at the same time. It's mad, and it's what makes the whole system unsustainable. And so the book I just wrote was all on how, not only why all this is screwed up and why we need a different system, but that central to that should be this notion of public purpose. And so, the institutes that I set up in London, this Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose, but what that means is putting some sort of common purpose at the center of the system. So if you want to kill the system with private debt, fine, that's your purpose, but no one says that. They talk about climate, they talk about inequality, they talk about the digital divide. So what would it look like to say, that's our goal, let's just take the digital divide, reducing the digital divide to zero, which is not a bad idea, given that during COVID, with all these kids in lockdown, many kids globally did not access their human right to education, because my kids might have good broadband, many people don't, they don't have access and so on. And then how do you then backtrack and structure the economy to deliver on that goal? That's actually the key theme of this World Health Organization, WHO, council that I'm running, Just Women. When people ask us why just women, we say, why the fuck not, given that all these other councils are all men. So it's a WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All, and our point is, if you say, what is the goal, which is to vaccinate the whole world, because the vaccine itself is not the mission, vaccination of everybody in the world, everybody in Africa should have the same number of vaccines we have, jabs. Then you backtrack and say, what does it mean for public procurement, budgeting, so outcomes-oriented budgeting, intellectual property rights, which are a way to privatize knowledge, which is a huge problem in the health space. So how do we restructure those? So structure the economy to deliver on the goals versus what we currently have, which is structure everything else to deliver on the economy, right? And so the idea of a mission-oriented approach and a moonshot-oriented approach, which is the title of the book, is to say, we would have never gotten to the moon ever 51 years ago had they said, here's a bit of money here, here's a money there, stir the soup, and hopefully we'll get there. They had to actually have an outcomes orientation. It was state-led, not micromanaged, lots of different companies, but they actually designed the collaboration, that public-private partnership, in really detailed ways. They had a no excess profits clause. This is so interesting that NASA, space agency, would have a no excess profits. In other words, don't turn space into a gambling casino, which is what space is today with the Elons and others kind of playboy guys up there filling it with debris. They also changed procurement, which is a huge chunk of government budgets. Just to give you a sense, in the UK, the whole innovation budget is 10 billion. Just the procurement budget of the Ministry of Transport, Department of Transport, is 40 billion. So this is the Department of Transport, which buys stuff to deliver on the roads, the bridges, the kind of stuff that Biden now is going to spend $1 trillion on. Government as purchaser if you have an outcomes orientation that can deliver on really important goals. So if you want like mobility systems that are 100% sustainable, 100% accessible by people with disabilities, that could be structured into your procurement contracts if you have a goal. The problem is there's no goals, right? Like the goal is like commercialization, economic value, growth for growth's sake, productivity. So the idea of the book is, what if the goals became the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them, which every country has signed up to, and you turn each and every one of them into several moonshots, like carbon neutral cities, plastic-free ocean, zero digital divide. In London, zero knife crime. Huge problem in London of knife crime. What would it look like to look at that as a problem and to say zero? That's the mission. And bring all sorts of different sectors to the table. So to go to the moon, it wasn't just aerospace, it was nutrition, materials, electronics, software. The plastic-free ocean mission today, without the arts, people like David Attenborough, who did this amazing documentary, Blue Planet, it wouldn't galvanize the imagination of kids and school children about that. So I'll shut up now because I'm going on too long, but it's like a mission-oriented approach means focusing on the goal and backtracking on the economy. And I feel like that people like you who make us think about, just coming to your amazing exhibit, you know, the global north, the global south, the tensions between them, and how we can actually deliver on a very different vision of where we want to go, so we don't have this kind of dichotomous view, but we have a, you know, the kind of discussions that we had the other night, that should be helping us think about those goals, bringing different voices to the table, and then restructuring the economy to deliver on that. And unfortunately, I don't think the people at the table are doing, or the right people. So at best, we have like trade unions arguing for the just transition to make sure that a green transition is just, but their voices are not at the table defining the green, the sustainability agenda.
Usually what I love listening to with Mariana, because I'm sort of deep in the art, in like arts thing and more cultural thing, is that like I feel like you give a overmap and then I go, oh yeah, this is how this sort of played out in this sort of sphere that I live in. And I think, you know, one of the points that you just said was like structure, sort of structuring everything to where now that it's sort of structuring everything to deliver to the economy. And I think what we do have now, at least in the quote unquote art world, is a sort of idea of artists as sort of producing almost exclusively for the economy. And I think part of that is because you have so many students who are in so much debt that they have to sort of end up making very strategic decisions about what happened after they graduate. But I was sort of thinking more so along the line of, because there is a lot of artists here, I think.
Raise your hand.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking about like, this, how do we get back to a place, because artists do need to survive. It's almost like impossible to sort of tell that kid who's $30,000 in debt that they shouldn't be making that type of painting or that type of artwork because they have to feed themselves. So I was sort of thinking about like, should the government be the one? Do we need to hold higher expectations of our government? Are we like in this place of like where governments are sort of race to the bottom in terms of who they're serving, and that we have like lost faith in terms of thinking about the role of the government in being for the people? because there's been so many, because we haven't understood the intentions of most governments. Like, we kind of think, oh, they're going to do this and that, and then they get into office, and it feels like there's only one sector of society that are getting served. And I think also one of the things that I don't really necessarily always try to put out there is because I think also what ends up happening is that you go to art schools, and there's like this weird, like, anti-capitalist attitude that amongst a lot of professors. And what ends up happening is that you don't necessarily have real conversations.
Yeah.
And I tell, like, in my neighborhood, 90% of the people are like not anti-capitalist. We're very much about like kind of wanting like a fair share, a fair shot or whatever. So I was just wondering, like, how much of art school is sort of doing students a disservice, how much of academia is doing students a disservice, how much of like our understanding of the role of government is sort of misplaced. But that wasn't more of a question, that was more of an observation. But
It's very interesting. Just one thing on that. I mean, I have, for some reason, I don't know why, lots of architect friends. And I'm always like, why don't you guys have a voice? It's like, we as economists, try to make things better. Again, giving ourselves all this attention. But it's true, though. Like, we write articles, whether it's in The Guardian, the FT, saying, this is wrong, austerity's wrong, invest, and don't cut the budgets of blah, blah, blah. And I never hear the artist's voice. And I don't know if it's because the newspapers aren't paying for that artist to write that column, in the FT or in the Observer or whatever the hell it may be in the New York Times, or if the artists themselves, and I'm thinking actually mainly of architects and designers, who again for some reason I've interacted with quite a bit, who don't have that voice. And part of it is how the work is. I mean, they work on commission, mainly. And if you work on commission, you don't really want to ruffle the feathers too much.
yeah.
And I don't think artists are in that same place. In some ways, the classic artist is the one who kind of like, sends everyone to hell and just does the cool thing and doesn't worry about the kind of, the square box. But have we actually, is that true, or is that just a stereotype? Like, could it be that actually the arts are almost worse than the economists because of the economics model? And I'm just saying this out of ignorance. I don't know the business model with the arts. Margot can tell us how she makes her money. Or not her money. Anyway, the arts world. I mean, I know that, Frieze art, when I go to the Frieze art exhibition in Regent's Park, or where it used to be at Regent's Park, there's a bunch of oligarchs looking at this great art. So it might be that, unfortunately, the arts world has actually become an expression of the worst part of financialized capitalism. And then this lack of kind of serious revolutionary voice in the normal papers. I don't mean the arts journals, and because who the hell reads them? I don't read them. But for normal people, we don't hear the artists' voices in terms of actually pushing against the frontier, saying this is wrong. Like, why was the King's Cross development done in that way? That's not a public space. It's presented to you as a public space, but it's not a public space. It's a private space. I hear that from the economists, not from the artists.
I guess how I look at it is that, and one of the things that you had sort of mentioned earlier that really kind of blew my mind when I think about city planning was that if you're that 52% of architects went to jobs to city jobs.
Yeah.
Right.
In the 50s.
In the 50s. So if you were an architect, you ended up working for the city, which meant that you worked for the general public.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's 0.07%.
0.7.
0.7%.
Less than 1%.
Less than 1% go to work for the city. So that means that almost all architects are working for private industry. I think personally I think sometimes art that is created by the state there's an attack. There has been an attack on it for quite some time. And public institutions, museums, etc., was sort of looked at as like in the face, like looked at as generally a public good. And if you look at like budget cuts and stuff like that, it's sort of like more and more museums, more and more artists are asked to like sort of depend on one type of model. And I was thinking, actually, this is sort of how I sort of think about it. I was having a conversation with a friend the other day, and I think we talked about this the other day, but she was talking about like, why was the Harlem Renaissance so innovative in terms of you had artists and so much creation coming out of it, and the kind of conclusion that we came under was that really what you had at the time was a sort of diversity of how the economy was sort of structured, all kind of coexisting with the same type of voice. And so you had like someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was Harvard educated, believed very much in a sort of talented 10, hyper-educated class, being also like having a voice maybe as powerful as Marcus Garvey, who was like, by all intents and purposes, extremely capitalist. His organization would have been worth like $3 billion today. He ran a newspaper, he was funding housing. But then you also had like many socialists, you had many communists. And so what you had was like a sort of diversity of voices in which people could kind of, you had Madam C.J. Walker, who kind of came out of a certain background. So you had like many different voices. And so people were able to sort of find how they were able to sort of grow, whereas I think nowadays what you have is a sort of, you have basically just sort of one kind of defining model and not enough space for other models to exist. So it's like, and it almost is like looked down upon for any other model. And it almost like in America, for example, and I think it's partly because we also play into this. Like last week, the U.S. pulled. There was plans to make maternity leave 8 weeks in the U.S. and it sort of got pulled out of the budget, and it was really, a friend of mine posted this thing where it's like, you know, it's technically legal to separate a dog from its puppy before 8 weeks because we have culturally understood that a dog that just gave birth needs time to heal and bond with its child. But somehow we can't understand that a woman who just gave birth and is technically still in pain and still healing from pushing out this huge thing out of them. You have 4 weeks later a boss calling her and saying, hey, you know, who works like some shitty retail job or Starbucks or whatever, some coffee shop, and say, hey, we really need you, it's gonna get busy today. And so this woman is sort of forced to then go to work, still in so much fucking pain, and then 6 o'clock come and she's ready to go home, and then the boss will go, man, it's gonna get really busy at 7. It's gonna get really busy at 7. And so that woman is now forced to say, dang, I just took 4 weeks off, I really need the money, maybe I'll work 4 extra hours and then nothing really happens. But somehow we've kind of, and then I looked at the newspaper, somebody sent me a copy of the newspaper, and it was Kanye West they were like, there's an interview that Kanye West did, which I actually loved, I thought it was really brilliant, but it was an interview that Kanye West did, and it was like, oh, Kanye West said Me Too's a hoax, and he's anti-Semitic, And I wonder so much of like what the problem is, what sort of is happening now is that we have a culture that tends to meet at like the tension points. So like things that we disagree with, as opposed to like meeting at like, and we're being fed into that like constantly, like we're constantly being fed into like, what are like our very real things, tensions that exist, whether it's around race and gender, but we're always sort of continually forced to meet at that point, and then it gets exasperated because we're sort of in these sort of like circles that don't really have any other voice, and then we walk in and we sort of we have, you know, it's very hard to meet someone when you think that they're morally wrong.
Yeah.
And so if you think that the next person standing next to you is morally wrong and you're morally right, you're very likely to not talk about, well, we're both women who both have to go to work in 4 weeks, regardless of like just having given birth. And so, I don't know, that was just a rant, which I always do. Sorry, that wasn't really a question.
But it's super important. Another strange fact, sorry to be the fact lady, you know, I said that private debt to disposable income is at record levels. Another fact is that the labor share of global income is at a record low. So GDP, gross domestic product, which is how we measure national output, can be measured in different ways, by demand, by output, or by income. And if you measure it by, if you measure it by the usual way that you would know, by demand, it's like GDP equals all the consumption spending, what you guys buy in cars, houses, vacations, investment, business investment in factories, so on, government investment, hospitals, schools, and net export. So C plus I plus G plus X minus N, more information than you need. But if you look at it from the share of income, it's literally like wages, profits, rents, and interest, and they will equal the same thing. And the labor share, literally the wage share of global income, is at a record low. The profit share is at a record high. So you would think, again, that people would know this. It's not in, you know, the public debate. And if you look at the role of labor unions in the past, trade unions, it's been to fight for the labor share. And so the kind of things you mentioned, maternity leave, sick pay, vacations, weekends, the fact we have a Saturday and Sunday where we don't work, guess what? People died for that. You know, this is my dream, to get like a proper film director to do a whole like film on just called Union, where like, you know, young people, I've got 4 young people, 4 kids, they don't know this. They don't know that so many of the rights that they will benefit from were fought for, people died for them. Right? So weekends, 8-hour workday, the fact that kids don't work in factories, the fact that there's good working conditions, sick pay, holiday, blah, blah, blah. People died for that. None of it came handed down from governments, from businesses, even from this big box that people call civil society. It was trade unions fought for that. And there's something about bringing back that movement, right? It's not just the labor movement. There's the Green movement, the student movement, you know, Fridays for the Future, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and so on. These are movements which in the history of capitalism made capitalism better, like hugely better, right? And instead of just embracing them and doing movies about them, there's something about what does it mean to then proactively, instead of just telling the story of history, which isn't told, that would be nice if it was told, but at best telling that story, get like it put into the design of the process. You know what I mean? Like I run again an institute trying to help governments completely change their way of thinking, to shape and create, not just to fix. But what does it mean to train civil servants to listen in an empathetic way? You know, sympathy and empathy aren't the same thing. Empathy means listening to movements. You know, literally, Fridays for the Future. So Greta Thunberg shows up at COP26 or in Davos, instead of just like petting her on the head, it's like, oh, isn't it cute? A 16-year-old and 18-year-old cares, like listening. Right? And that, I think, is the future. Like, that's what's being demanded, which is to be present in the project, in the planning, and
Yeah.
the design of the future, not just reacting against the rubbish generation that didn't solve the climate problem.
Yeah.
Because that's what these students now are fighting for. They're like, you bastards didn't do what you should have done. You better do it now and do it quickly. It's urgent, but that's still reactive. Whereas, like, for example, with the data problem that we were briefly talking about when you were explaining to me your amazing exhibit, I kind of feel like 13, 14, 15-year-old kids who are like constantly on their phones in a very, like, you know, way that I don't even understand, they should be in the front line of the battle around big tech, not reacting to the rubbish generation that didn't do the right thing, as it is with climate. And what does that mean for then government civil servants to be trained to listen to those voices so that we actually get the system right in the first place?
Yeah,
like, that's like the whole new world, which I wish existed, but I'm you know, I mean, that means speaking to you more and less just to the Davos jet set who are pretend that they know everything when they actually have very little expertise.
Yeah, I mean, but I also think sort of the problem, this is sort of going to tie both, is that if you go to most art schools and you talk to a lot of students, and this is sort of something I've been kind of struggling to kind of deal with emotionally, but also trying to figure out a bit. And I'm not really sure what are sort of the systemic issues that sort of has created this condition, but I find that I have, like, today more friends who are even art friends who become like more extremely upset about like what quote unquote the billionaire class are buying with their money, and the art market really is just a very, I mean, in terms of when you're talking trillions and trillions and stuff like that, the art market is like what gets counted in these sort of spectacle newspapers are really just like a few $1 billion. And that's saying a few $1 billion isn't a lot of money, but when you look at the overall economy, it doesn't really solve anything. So I often kind of look at it as sort of one of those things where we're meeting at the tension point rather than like meeting at the larger issues of like, hey, we're all fucking in debt. Or we're all like in these sort of much more kind of complicated economic situations that we kind of need to get ourselves out of. It's like, for me, it doesn't really solve the problem if somebody buys a $100 million Rothko painting. I'm more interested in like, how do we all get out of debt? And I think part of the problem though also, and I think this is also one of the things that I get a little bit sort of thing is that I'm deeply, deeply anti-war. Because the year I was born, America invaded the country that I was born in. And you know, we don't really talk about like how much war affects people's lives. And I think what we end up having in America especially is a conversation around like, oh, we need to tax the rich, but almost exclusively, maybe all of that money is going to go towards the military. Yeah. And very, very few percentage is going to go towards maybe education or school or whatever. And so what you have is sort of like, I think to your brilliance is like, we need to talk about like where we expect our governments to head and sort of center our imagination around this new social contract. Because if all we're doing is sort of getting mad at the billionaires and saying we need to tax them, and I do think that, of course, Amazon needs to pay more taxes, but if all we're going to do is sort of tax it, but then it ends up going to the military, then that just means that there's going to be more kids in Afghanistan getting their heads blown by some random drone. And so to me, that just becomes like the worst outcome. It's like, oh yeah, we just took all this extra money and then we just did the exact opposite. So I think really it's like maybe just first thing starting from just reimagine what do we want from our government. And what do we want, what what should be the 16-year-old conversations in terms of the data that they're being given, because you're going to have like a whole bunch. I mean, I really, I have nieces and nephews, and there's like 13-year-old kids who will have their masturbation videos forever immortalized on the internet. And I just think, like, where are they in the conversation exactly to that point? Like, where are they in terms of this thing that is going to forever be in the sort of data about them?
Yeah.
Where are they in those conversations? And that's kind of what the exhibition is, if I had to break it down. But maybe it's a little late. Should we open up for one or two questions, or you guys are bored and you want to go catch that ice cream truck that left? We could probably still catch it.
A lot of the technologies that were developed for private ends, that are now used by private ends, were developed by the public sector.
Yeah.
But in reality, in relation to what Alvaro, you said towards the end of the talk, that public sector, that was just the military, as in like telecommunications, radiophonics, that was all developed by the military for reaching military like invasion ends. And and then obviously that's like a massive private money-making scheme in terms of like then the companies which developed those technologies then became private afterwards. So the people who developed those technologies for the public sector then created like Serco, all these like massive corporations. And I was wondering if we're imagining like a restructuring of like a public and private collaboration as like a mission-based outcome strategy, and how do we stop that from happening? How do we stop then those those collaborations between the public and the private sector from blowing up into just like these huge corporations, which then just become kind of uber national instead of working for like international ends? And how do we stop that from being like imperialist and kind of single nation centered, like just for the benefit of the US, just for the benefit of the UK? How do we generate like outcomes where the rewards are actually distributed among everybody?
So, great question. I'm glad it's being videoed so we can get a transcript. There's different issues. One is, Google's algorithm was funded by the National Science Foundation. The internet that then Google uses was funded by DARPA. The World Wide Web was funded by CERN, which is global, it's not US. So somehow we've gotten into this really bad mode where we just think we can just fund stuff. Forget the bit about the military, because it also happens in health. Like the US spends $40 billion a year, so a shitload of money, on health innovation, and then doesn't bother to make sure that the citizens funding it can afford it. So prices literally can go to what the market can bear through this completely dysfunctional idea of value-based pricing, which I won't explain to you. It'll take too long, but the point is literally the prices can go to whatever. And then the welfare state comes in through Medicare and Medicaid in the US, or here through the NHS, or this thing called NICE, to bring the prices down. So citizens are paying 2, 3, 4 different times. The intellectual property rights are completely abused, so they're too upstream, meaning that the tools for research are privatized. Patents weren't meant to do that. Patents were meant to be much more downstream. We're patenting the tools, like the hammer and the screwdriver. Patents are too wide because they're used for strategic reasons, just to keep, like cats or dogs, I can't remember when they piss, to keep away the enemy. Like literally that's what patents are used for. And they're too strong, hard to license. So we've allowed patents, intellectual property rights, to be abused just to extract value, even though the technology was funded by the public sector. So it's literally the public sector not even knowing how to fight for the right deal. By the way, in the US, there's something called march-in rights, which is the government has the right to keep prices of drugs low when it funds the drugs, and it funds 75% of new molecular entities with priority rating. Too much information. They've never exercised that right, because they're like the narrative that it's big pharma doing all the innovation. So even in the US where they fund the innovation, they don't have the confidence then to keep those prices low. So the first point is, given that you're funding all this crap, why not govern it from the beginning to be centered on kind of public goals, like issues around privacy today. You know, Shoshana Zuboff's wonderful book, Surveillance Capitalism, is all about like, you think you're searching Google for free? Ha ha ha, Google searching you for free, right? So that could have been taken care of with all sorts of conditionality and governance mechanisms ex ante from the beginning. You shouldn't have to pick up the mess ex post. So that's one thing. But the other big thing is, given your point, and then your point also about the military-industrial complex, that's how it used to be funded. All the examples I gave in your iPhone were military-industrial complex. But it's just as true in green innovation and health innovation. It's all government finance in the beginning: solar, wind, fusion. The reason I speak like I sound like an American, I promise, I was born in Italy. I'm 100% Italian. We went to America when I was 5 because my dad does fusion, funded by the Department of Energy at Princeton University. So all the fusion, solar, wind, biofuels, you know, today green hydrogen, it's all government funded. That's not necessarily good if you then don't govern green innovation with certain principles around common good, public good, to make sure that it doesn't then get abused, or socialization of risk, privatization of rewards, et cetera. So strangely, going from this huge global US and whatever context, my learning, coming back to what you said in the beginning, practice-based theorizing, I guess you know, we talked about that on Sunday, is the really local stuff that gets me excited is things like in Camden, where I live, where you came the other night. So Camden Council has this Camden Renewal Commission, which I co-chair with Georgia Gould, the Camden Councilor, and what we're trying to do is to bring the missions, this idea of missions and moonshots, to the very local. So if you have a clean growth mission, which is in Camden about choosing 10 housing estates, projects, and to be like the funnel through which clean growth happens, the first thing you have to do is to bring the residents who live in those homes to the table to talk about what do we even mean by sustainable growth, what is green? Again, how do we want to live together so it's not just a technocentric, like retrofit your homes and everything will be fine. It's a much, much bigger question. And the reason you have all this like backlash in France with the Gilets jaunes, or in Australia where the Labour Party was sure they were going to win. I was there in December 2 years ago, just before the election. They were 100% sure they were going to win. They lost the election over climate change. Like, workers just were like, I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to, you know, my skills to go, you know, to shit, whatever. So they didn't have the narrative, the framing to talk about that. But you can't just like brainwash people into that. You need to interact. So I think the kind of fundamental point that I want to come to, besides the kind of techno bit about algorithmic rents, which is a very interesting concept, how do we actually interact with society? How do we, you know, Olafur Eliasson, who you might know, is, I'm sure you know him anyway, he's an artist, and we interacted with his Tate exhibit. He had an interview with me about public space, and he had a really nice concept that public space is a space where you should feel safe to disagree, right? So social media is the opposite. Everyone's like at each other. What if we actually designed squares and public spaces like this to have serious interaction where we feel safe to disagree, where it's not what you were telling me before, and you also mentioned now, where people are like scared to say something because someone's going to label you as anti-this, anti-that on both sides of the spectrum. And so that designing of society, cities, public square spaces, and from Italy's point of view, the la piazza, to feel safe to disagree, I feel like we need more of that, and it can only be led by people like yourselves. And I feel like in a moment where we're again putting trillions into the system, as we did after the financial crisis, and it went to waste, we're doing it again, making sure that the structures on the ground are places of debate, of contestation, where we then think together where we want to go, given that growth has not just a rate but a direction, so that directionality is a space to be contested. I feel like that's what, I only have to learn. I have nothing to preach on that. And that is about doing what FDR did, which is to bring artists to the table around the direction of the recovery. The whole WPA, the experimentation, the new ways to envision what it was all about to recover from such a tragedy, which the Great Depression was, where people died of hunger. That wasn't just about fill the system with concrete bridges and roads and infrastructure for the sake of infrastructure. It was about, let's open up the thinking of where the hell do we want to go in the first place.
Yeah. I think that also brought up 2 points in which sort of why I think we need a diversity in terms of how we approach where art comes from. Because in America, there was this sort of big moment where Robert Mapplethorpe, who was a gay photographer and doing like shooting S&M stuff, his art was sort of used as a sort of as an example of why to cut arts funding in the U.S. under Reagan, but you know, there were groups of collectors and thinkers who was extremely excited about him who kept his name alive. And so I think, in a way, I mean, and this is something I do think that you know, like, I remember, you know, it's not that, like, I remember there was a point where you're like, you know, it's not that all hedge funds are bad, and this is not to, like, sort of say hedge funders are all, and I think we get into the sort of, like, very, like, simple kind of minded reading of things. So what we're saying is that it's that there's maybe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I think is, like, much more of a balanced ecosystem where many things get to exist, but that we're not sort of in the space where it's now just like one or two entities being the sole kind of winners of these things. And I think that's kind of where we are right now, in that it's maybe in America there is no arts funding. There's very, very few arts funding from the government. So all you have is almost exclusively kind of private donations, where I do think there was a period where you need arts funding from the government, but I also know that arts funding from the government can at times reflect the interest of a group of people who don't necessarily, who may be conservative at times, who may be, you know, and so I think it's a much more, and like not all hedge funders are bad. There are like many hedge funders who do very interesting investments. But I think we kind of get into like a sort of, or maybe not, I don't know. I don't know any hedge funders, but I just kind of thought maybe I should like.
Well, finance for sure.
Finance,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Or maybe, I don't know.
Hedge funds are pretty much all bad.
I don't even know what hedge funds mean. I thought I was sounding smart. But this is why I try to shut up about words. That's why I stay in art, you know, because I'm like, I don't know what that is. I had a lot of, you know.
No, but what you're saying is so important. I feel like so that this dichotomous view of, you know, in the broad way, public, private, but even within the private, to put all the private sector in one box. I mean, we were talking before about, I feel uncomfortable about talking about the global south all in one box. Like, I work a lot with like prime ministers and presidents in different countries in the global south. They are so different one from the other. Every country. In Africa, they're so different, African countries one from the other. This concept of BRICS that Goldman Sachs, you know, had the guts to come up with. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, those countries, I work with them, they are so different one from one another. So putting them all in this one box, we would never do that with Europe, right? Like France and Italy, I'm from Italy, they are so different. In Italy, you know, Genova and Savona, they're like 10 kilometers away, they are so different one from the other. Somehow, especially amongst, you know, the so-called disadvantaged, we put them into this huge box, right? And so there's something about doing exactly what you're saying, which is that granularity.
Yeah.
You know, finance. Well, let's talk about which finance works. So I work with public banks. Some public, well, first of all, they're different from private banks, already there, a bit of granularity. But within the public banks, some are really rubbish. Like the Italian public bank just gives out money to whichever sector needs money because it's dying, and you know, here's a loan, here's a subsidy guarantee to stay in place. In Germany, the public bank recently gave money to the steel sector, which globally is having problems with strong conditions attached, that steel had to lower its material content, just like cement and your wonderful concrete here should be lowering its material content, and they had to do it to get a public loan. And they did it through repurpose, reuse, recycle technology across the whole value chain, not because they went to Davos and talked about stakeholder value and purpose, but because they had to get one penny out of the government. So that kind of conditionality matters, and that public bank did it, the Italian public bank didn't. And here, with COVID-19 recovery funds, we gave a $600 million bailout to EasyJet, no conditions attached, whereas in France, the loan to Air France and Renault was conditional on them reducing their carbon emissions. So how you do this stuff matters, and I think that's actually quite encouraging. Marx had this great quote in Capital, actually it was in the Grundrisse, his notes when he was writing Capital. He said, why is it that when you see a spider web, it looks like amazing, right? Like if you ever look at a spider web, like, oh my God. And then you see these like shitty houses like on the Italian countryside made by, in Italy we call it geometry, like low-level architects. And he said, why is it the house better, or that architect better than the spider? When actually the spider, you're like in awe. And it's like, because they thought about it first. There was that planning, like the thinking, that you think first and then act. So as humans, we can think. We have decision making, we have strategy. It differentiates us from spiders, as Mark said, but that does mean that decisions matter. So instead of talking about business or hedge funds, what are the decisions being made within that business? Pfizer, by the way, sorry, I promise to shut up. You know, there's these 6 vaccines. The Pfizer vaccine is incredibly problematic. Like, there's no sharing of the intellectual property rights. They made it so it can only be stored in these crazy temperatures so the global south can't use them. The prices and costs were not negotiated. Whereas AstraZeneca, even though it got all this bad reputation because of other external factors, they negotiated. They said price and costs have to remain low, intellectual property rights shared, and the temperature couldn't be so low that it couldn't be used, and that matters. So even with the vaccine, they're not all the same. And Pfizer, by the way, is one of the most financialized companies in the world. They spend more on share buybacks than what they spend on R&D, and they went into that project with BioNTech last minute when all the research had been funded elsewhere. So I think we need to do exactly what you're saying, is instead of having this kind of like dichotomous view of public, private, or all of hedge funds are bad, or all of finance is bad, look at what actually happened on the ground, and let's scale up the good lessons, and name call the stuff that's happening bad, but be specific instead of getting into this ideology.
I'm sorry, but I feel that that was a long question and an even longer answer. But thank you both so much. That was such a pleasure and so interesting. And thank you to you, the audience. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.